And we're back at home, but not in the studio, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your chilly, but not as chilly as it's been, Groundhog Day evening here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Well, this will be the newest entry in our continuing series simply titled The Great Movies. And this is a film that I am an enormous fan of. It's in the category of movies that some of you have no doubt seen if you're under 40. You're under 30? I don't know. The film is now 22 and a half years old. But it has a recognizable cast of actors and actresses. It's a film that got fantastic critical reviews upon release. It's well into the 90s, 90% that is, on Rotten Tomatoes. And there is a supporting actor in this movie that had incredible Oscar buzz and just didn't get the Oscar nomination. In fact, this film, in what was probably the biggest surprise, was completely shut out at the 2004 Oscars for films released in 2003. The newest entry in the series, The Great Movies, is Billy Ray's 2003 historical based, it's not really a docudrama, but it is a movie that is based on fact. Some people would call it a docudrama because it is very, very accurate in how it tells its story. But the movie is called Shattered Glass. And the reason why it's called Shattered Glass, in the immortal words of the comedian Robert Klein, it's a double entendre. It's a double meaning of a title. Because we know what shattered glass represents in our regular lives. But there was and still is, a real-life journalist named Stephen Glass who wrote for a super successful, very kind of hip, ahead of its time, trendy, if you want to use that word, if that's even still in common usage, but he wrote for the New Republic. And the New Republic was a very highly read and highly respected magazine among the Beltway, meaning Washington insiders, movers and shakers in Washington, D.C., from presidents on down. Everybody checked out the New Republic, even if they didn't agree with, the political leanings of some of the columnists and people who wrote these feature articles. But it was a good way to measure the pulse of D.C. and the pulse of the political sphere in general. Stephen Glass wrote for the New Republic, and then things went wrong, we'll put it that way, because I would rather just, talk about the movie than the real story. But the double meaning is the fact that it was this man named Stephen Glass, and the title Shattered Glass, without me explaining any further at this point, you can probably guess what happens. Maybe not exactly, but you could guess why that's the title. So Hayden Christiansen, who is somebody that I respect, that I have been a fan of from the beginning. And he's a person who Gen X rejected almost entirely. We didn't like what he did in Star Wars Episode 2. There were a lot of people who were pissed off that he got the role of Anakin Skywalker, the pivotal role, basically. If when we watched as kids, speaking of Generation X, we watched episodes 4, 5, and 6 of Star Wars. The main character is Luke Skywalker. But the Star Wars, the 9-movie saga, the 9 movies that are considered canon, another great New York University film school word, Anakin Skywalker is the central character, is what I'm saying, not Luke. But that's beside the point. There were a lot of people who thought that Hayden Christensen didn't do enough with the role, that he was horribly miscast. He had no chemistry with Natalie Portman, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We all heard this. In more recent years, we've all had a change of heart. Well, not me, because I had no problem with the guy. I liked him in a movie that he did with Kevin Kline before Star Wars Episode 2 called Life as a House. Terrific. Jenna Malone was in it. Really, really good movie. Kristen Scott Thomas also. So I was not one of those people. I'm not the angry Gen Xer who claimed that George Lucas ruined my childhood with the prequels. First, George Lucas ruined our childhood, if you listen to Gen Xers tell it. He ruined our childhood by digitally altering the Star Wars episodes 4, 5, and 6 for theatrical release, destroyed, ruined our childhood. It's like our entire existences were destroyed because of George Lucas. And then he ruined our childhoods even more because the prequel trilogy sucked. Now you have a whole generation of people saying the prequel trilogy was fantastic, but episodes 7, 8, 9 suck. 20 years from now, there are going to be people saying that episodes 7, 8, 9 are the best. Star Wars fans are fucking miserable. That's a hill I'll go down, and they're fucking miserable. They were miserable when I was a kid. They're always bitching and moaning about something or other. And George Lucas was the Antichrist, and now, I mean, it's just all stupid, right? Everybody is absurd. J.J. Abrams now is the Antichrist. Now we like George Lucas again. We didn't like him in the 90s, now we like him. Anyway, the point is, there was nothing wrong with Hayden Christensen in those films. And he got this role because not just the writer-director Billy Ray, but there were other people who said, no, this kid's got talent. He's got chops. Don't listen to the Star Wars haters who claim to be fans but hate everything about every Star Wars while saying Star Wars is my life. There was nothing wrong. The part was underwritten. Star Wars Episode 2, they could have done a better job with the script. Wasn't his fault. So, in this movie, Hayden Christensen plays the real life. Again, sorry for the way I was explaining this, but it's a real guy. It's not a documentary. And it's not really a fictional film. It's fictional in the sense that there are actors, but a very high percentage of this movie really happened exactly the way it's presented. The veracity is all there. And a lot of people have talked about it. If you go on YouTube, you can find some interesting featurettes and short documentaries talking about this. Stephen Glass was a superstar young reporter who was already probably making too much money. Hate to say it, but he was probably already making too much money. And he was a character, a born storyteller, a natural storyteller. And he was a rising star at the New Republic. And the editor, when he kind of first made his entry, and this is all in the film. The film has an interesting non-linear structure. For huge chunks of it, it is linear. But there are elements where it is non-linear, not in the manner of Pulp Fiction, but that the story is not told A to B to C. We kind of move around through time. But when Stephen Glass, as played by Hayden Christensen, he is really starting to make it with the New Republic. His editor is a guy named Mike Kelly, who, the real Mike Kelly, unfortunately, is a tragic figure because he went to Iraq. He was one of the embedded journalists. He wasn't with the Wall Street Journal, but he was with a major publication, and he was an embedded journalist. I think he was blown up by a roadside bomb and died. And he's played, the real Michael Kelly is played in this movie by Hank Azaria, who, you know, he kind of, I'm hot and cold on him. He's an enormously talented guy, but watching the movie The Birdcage, I hated his character so much, it ruined the movie for me. And I'm sorry, I'm embarrassed to say that, but I hated the character that he played. That's not a knock on the actor because he's great. And he, of course, is on the wrong end of Al Pacino's "she's got a great ass and you've got your head all the way up it" in Michael Mann's Heat. Fucking great. Why'd I have to get mixed up with that? Well, because she got a great ass. In Shattered Glass, he plays the editor who adores Stephen Glass. And we see that there are certain corners, at the very least, there are certain corners that Stephen Glass is already cutting at this point, at the very least. You'll understand why I'm saying that if you haven't seen this movie or know this story. But he likes Stephen Glass so much, and Glass is such a character and such a wonderful, he's good around the office. You know, there's something to be said for getting coffee and getting donuts and lunch and remembering everyone's order, right? We saw that on Dexter, a little bit of what happens in Dexter. I don't know that they necessarily, you know, took from that, but Dexter Morgan in that show, he's always the guy getting people coffee and being a people person and being kind to the staff and never talking down to people. There is something to be said for how you treat people, and Stephen Glass is very popular. And then Michael Kelly gets let go, and they bring in a guy named Chuck Lane, who had been a reporter, and now he's going to be the editor-in-chief of the New Republic. And Chuck Lane is played in the film by Peter Sarsgaard, who is dynamite. And that's the actor I didn't name and reference when I talked about all of the Oscar buzz this film had, but on him in particular, he won a number of awards on the, not really the independent film circuit, but, you know, like Boston Society of Film Critics, New York Film Circle. He won a number of awards for supporting actor. That is how dynamic he is in this film. And really, it's a great character to play. It's not always just about the skill of the performer, but how good of a character is it to play. So when Chuck Lane takes over at the New Republic, he believes in old school journalism, as Michael Kelly did, but he also believes in being more hands-on. And there is an idea that when people reach a certain level in certain businesses, that they don't work as hard as they did previously. And the real Chuck Lane was not that guy. And as played by Peter Sarsgaard, he is a detail-oriented kind of a person. And we start to see cracks form in Stephen Glass in some of the stories that he had already, not just filed, but had printed and published in the New Republic. And so he writes a story, and I should point out, this takes place in the early internet era, or early-ish, where you could get away with a lot of stuff if you were clever and you covered your tracks and you had a couple of people backing you up. You could get away with more stuff then than you can now. So Stephen Glass came up with this story that he wrote about this young kid, a kind of what you would call a silicone sorcerer, a young kid hacking and terrorizing major corporations, or at least corporations that were significant. And he writes this elaborate article, and he has copious notes, and he seems to have everything together as far as, if you need to check up on something, if you need to call somebody to verify my work, everything looks to be in place. And the story goes through. This is not that crazy. You have people who are fact checkers, but there is at least then, now there probably isn't. You don't need it because you can click so many things at the touch of a button, literally. But there are fact checkers at the New Republic. There are people whose job it is now, but was in the 90s, in the 80s, before the internet existed. Their job was to go over the writer's notes. The assumption is that a writer's notes are going to be legitimate, that he is not going to fabricate anything, because why? Well, that's a good question. That's a really good question, in fact. So this story gets published, and it causes a sensation because a lot of people are embarrassed. And a real-life person who worked for, not Forbes magazine, but Forbes magazine when they took up an online presence, when they first got online. They didn't actually have the magazine online yet, but sometime in the 1997 or 98 range, a young guy by the name of Adam Pennebaker, who worked for Forbes Digital, he saw this story. And he got in trouble with Forbes Digital, with the people above him, because he should have known about this silicone sorcerer kid. Why didn't you know about this? Why hadn't you heard of this kid? And he starts thinking, how can I have fucked up? I thought that I was, the character of Pennebaker is played by Steve Zahn. And we know Steve Zahn usually plays the Owen Wilson type, laid back, surfer vibe kind of guy. And in this film, he has little bits of the screen persona that we know and love. But this character is not a clown. This character tries to figure out, how could I have missed this? Why haven't I heard of this kid? And he questions himself first. Again, he does not assume that there is anything wrong with Stephen Glass's reporting. He thinks that he's the one who made the mistake. So as part of trying to figure out exactly what happened, he begins to look into this story, this kid. And he can't find anything. He can't find anything. And the more he digs, the more it just doesn't make any sense, because this story, it appears to be well-sourced, but there's no evidence that any person like this even exists. It feels like he made this all up. And Forbes Digital has enough where their head person, I forgot, I think it's Mark Blum, actually, an actor who was in a lot of movies in the 90s, but I could be wrong about that. I'm not sure that he's the one who plays this part, but someone at Forbes Digital calls the New Republic to speak to Chuck Lane. She says, look, we got a big problem with your story here. This doesn't make any sense to us. So without giving the entire movie away, Chuck Lane confronts Stephen Glass. But the confrontation at first is not thinking that he made everything up, but that he was sloppy in his reporting. There's a difference between being sloppy in your reporting and cutting corners and making assumptions. In other words, there could be a version of this where this silicone sorcerer kid exists, but Stephen Glass fabricated 80% of the story. When Chuck Lane first confronts Stephen Glass, that's what he thinks. The assumption is the kid was sloppy, the kid made a mistake, and let's just see how deep it goes. And the further that Chuck Lane digs, the worse it looks for Stephen Glass. We start to get the idea that he invented this entire story. Now, you're allowed to do that if you tell people. It's like the James Fry A Million Little Pieces. If he doesn't call it a memoir, if he says this is a work of fiction, but a lot of it really happened, you're fine. You're not breaking any rules. But it's that Stephen Glass is portraying this as a real person who wreaked havoc when doesn't seem to be any evidence that this kid, even under a pseudonym, that there is anybody doing anything like what Stephen Glass has surmised and has written about in this piece. So when Peter Sarsgaard as Chuck Lane goes to the staff and says what he has to do, which is like, I got to fire him. I don't even know what to do. Stephen Glass is so popular. He is so beloved by his fellow writers, and their play, or two of the people that he is close to. One is played by Melanie Lynskey, who's really good in this movie, and the other is played by Chloe Sevigny, who's also really, really good. Chloe Sevigny, to me, is kind of undersold as to just how talented and resourceful of an actress. Her first big movie was a very polarizing and brutal film called Kids. She's great in that, and she's also terrific in a film with Woody Harrelson, Gina Gershon, Elizabeth Shue, called Palmetto, kind of an undersold great mystery noir from the late 90s. But the two of them completely reject, at first, what they're being told. They don't accept that their guy, one of their best friends and somebody who they adore, he couldn't have done this. Well, this is what happened. So it looks like there's going to be a little bit of a resolution where maybe he'll get suspended, maybe he'll get fined, and he'll promise not to do it, he'll make restitution, whatever. But Chuck Lane, being the detail-oriented and very thorough individual that he is not going to leave well enough alone. He needs to know a little bit more. So he goes back in time, not literally, and starts checking out a lot of Stephen Glass's earlier work that was published to wide acclaim in the New Republic. And he realizes the kid fabricated most of his stories. There's very little truth in anything that he wrote. And then the joke Steve Zahn even says is, can you find anything here that you can verify? And, Steve Zahn, as Adam Pennebaker, says, well, yeah, there is a state called Florida in the Union. There is a New York, and there is an area called Washington, D.C. Yeah, that's terrific. Stephen Glass gets deep sixed. And you ask yourself, how could something like this happen? Well, it can't happen now. You could create a story and say that there is a real person, but you're not going to be able to do what he did, close to 3 decades ago. There's just too many ways to double check and fact check. And fact checking from that perspective, I would think, has become easier. But this movie is a study of different kinds of characters. As played by Hayden Christiansen, Stephen Glass is a brat. He is a whiner, and he is somebody who desperately wants to be liked. He has good ideas as far as I say, being nice to other people, but you should also want to be respected. And the kind of tragedy of Stephen Glass is he clearly had the talent to be a good journalist. He had the talent to tell great stories, but great stories that were real and true. And he chose a different path. And the moments of confrontation between Stephen Glass and Chuck Lane, it's really beautiful work with the two guys. The way that Hayden keeps saying, didn't do anything wrong, I didn't do anything wrong. And finally, Chuck Lane can't take it anymore, and he shouts, and it's the kind of show-stopping moment that should have gotten Sarsgaard an Oscar nomination. I really wish you'd stop saying that. Stop saying you didn't do anything wrong, okay? Don't insult me. Don't insult me. Don't insult the integrity of this magazine. We might go out of business, you fucking punk. Words to that effect. And it's such a well-acted story. And, you know, it is the kind of thing where you say, it's almost hard to believe that it actually happened, but the movie portrays things really, really well. And we can see how things slip through the cracks. Because the default setting for most people is not to assume that someone else is a fabulist, as Stephen Glass was, or somebody that is just going to be full of shit 100% of the time. We want to believe when people look us in the eye that they're not full of shit. They have notes, and if we call certain numbers, it's going to be legitimate, you know? And it's a good moment when something like that does happen in real life. But in the world of this film, it just keeps getting worse. And, you know, as Hayden's character of Stephen Glass, as he spirals, we almost can feel bad for him, but how bad can we feel? Because a great magazine almost ceased publication. They almost were dragged under by him cutting so many corners and just not giving a shit about journalist ethics. Like, there's different levels of journalist ethics. And I mentioned this in an episode from quite some time ago in the movie The Year of Living Dangerously. That's a fictional story based on true events. But the Mel Gibson character, I think, is supposed to be kind of an amalgamation of a number of people who work for the Australian Broadcasting Service. But in the world of that film, the journalist ethics issue is not this. It's not Mel's character fabricating stories. No, it's the opposite. It's that his character is given privileged information. He's given information to save his life. There is going to be a violent overthrow in about 36 hours. We got to get the fuck out of here. Don't tell anybody. Let's just quietly leave. The Sigourney Weaver character basically saying the journalist ethics is Mel Gibson's Guy Hamilton. He sees dollar signs. He might be able to win a Pulitzer Prize. So maybe he goes public with the story at the expense of getting both he and Sigourney killed. Maybe he does. That's journalist ethics. Sorry, I was saying that in the world of this movie, you don't know if Stephen Glass is ever being straightforward with you, or if he's just completely full of shit 100% of the time. And it's such good work from Hayden, and Sarsgaard is just incredible. He really is. Just an amazing performance, a cinematic crime that he didn't at least get the courtesy of an Oscar nomination. But this movie, it was not a hit. Even it didn't cost that much money, but it way underperformed at the box office. I don't think it even grossed back its production cost. It is streaming free. It's free on Amazon Prime. It's free on Tubi and a couple of other apps. This film gets my highest recommendation. I don't know anyone who has seen it who doesn't like it, doesn't say, man, it really gets into very, very heavy stuff that you're not, that you're really not expecting. So, yeah, the newest entry in our continuing series of the great movies is Billy Ray's 2003 docudrama, historical fact, however you want to classify it, but a great, great movie, Shattered Glass, starring Hayden Christiansen and Peter Sarsgaard, Melanie Linsky, Chloe Sevigny, Rosario Dawson, who works with Steve Zahn at Forbes Digital, and also, sadly, well, not sadly, Hank Azaria, sadly because the character that he played passed away. This has been episode 670 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your Groundhog Day evening here with me in New York. And if you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.